back to my channel. Thank you for your comments. I'll try and do a comments video later. I just wanted to carry on talking about this new study from Nature magazine suggesting that autism is not one disorder, which is what new data shows. Which obviously doesn't surprise me, because that's something I kind of already know anyway. I mean, that's kind of common, when you think about it, it's kind of quite... One can probably sort of work that out just using reason alone, but science is based upon evidence, so you can't just... You know, it's all very well kind of rationally assuming something based upon reason, but you need to empirically test it. And this study is a scientific study which has looked at thousands of genes across several cohorts, and involves, you know, a longitudinal study looking at the development of traits over time, and it suggests that that essentially autism is not one disorder. There have been other studies as well looking at the different subtypes of autism. So I guess it's just one of several studies. And there are likely to be, you know, quite a few more subtypes that have yet to be identified. I guess it's just kind of preliminary research, but obviously needs to be replicated. But it does kind of make sense, you know, like I already rationally kind of worked out that autism wasn't one condition. I think it's just kind of obvious when you think about it, you know, it can't be one condition, how can it be? It just, you know, so yeah, it didn't surprise me, but interesting. I do have quite a few questions though about this particular study. While I'm not disputing the fact that autism isn't one disorder, that it's many disorders, I'm not disputing that. I'm not entirely sure how accurate it is maybe to create subtypes just based upon age of diagnosis. I think there are many questions unanswered in my mind about that. You know, how do you separate out issues around access to diagnosis, you know, parental awareness, education, all of those things? How do you separate that out from any biological determinants of age of diagnosis? This study attempted to do that by looking at genes, and it said that, according to the study, it was a sort of statistically significant correlation with genes, and those other factors had less of an impact than the role of genes. But this was based upon like many people. So obviously this is a crude average. You know, there are obviously going to be many outliers. It doesn't mean that just because someone's diagnosed late, that their autism is different to someone diagnosed early, or vice versa. There are going to be people who are diagnosed late who did have those very early obvious autistic signs. They just, for whatever reason, didn't get a diagnosis. Conversely, there are going to be people who are diagnosed early just because they had very aware parents, or whatever reason were, I don't know. There could be a whole range of reasons why they got an early diagnosis, so it doesn't mean that just because you're in one group or the other that your autism is necessarily different to the other type. Because it's just a very broad brush average, it's just across averages. You've noticed this trend for there to be two different types of autism based upon age of diagnosis, with the implication being that those diagnosed earlier have more kind of signs that become more obvious signs from an early age, whereas those who are diagnosed later, the idea being that maybe their signs weren't quite as obvious, so that resulted in later diagnosis, and then those signs just got more obvious over time until the person, you know, met great difficulty and then got assessed, whereas they might not have got that autism diagnosis at an earlier age, potentially. But as I say, I guess it's just across averages. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be individual outliers. As with any study, it's just based upon averages. So I did a little bit more reading on this, just read a few other articles just to get some more clarity on this. So the research says that people who learn they have autism after the age of 6, so they're using 6 as like a benchmark, whereas if you get diagnosed before 6, that's an early diagnosis, after age 6, a later diagnosis. People who learn they have autism after age 6 are often described as having quote-unquote milder form of autism than those diagnosed as toddlers or like in preschool age. But the new study challenges that assumption. A genetic analysis finds that people diagnosed in later childhood or teens or even adulthood actually have a different form of autism, not a less severe one. So that's good. That's a good outcome from this study, because it's easy for people to assume that just because someone wasn't diagnosed at an early age, that means their autism is less valid, less real, less severe. But this study is saying no, that isn't the case. It's simply the case that their autism manifests differently. It develops differently. It follows a different trajectory. It doesn't mean it's any less severe. It's just a different type of autism, essentially. Remember, as I said before, on average, it doesn't. Some people who are diagnosed late did have those early signs and might have the same type of autism as those diagnosed early, because for whatever reason they didn't get that earlier diagnosis when even though they did have those early signs. So we're just talking here about averages. But yeah, whatever group you fall into, both types of autism can be just as severe, potentially. So it's got nothing to do with severity. That's a very important point I wanted to emphasise here. So it's good that they're saying that this is just a different form of autism based upon different genetic variants that the person has inherited, which means that their autism develops differently. In the case of those with a late onset presentation, they might only have very, very subtle signs, say in the first 6 years of life, signs that just go beneath the radar because they're not obvious enough to kind of cause major concerns maybe. And then those signs are still there, they're just not like obvious enough. And then as the person gets older, those signs then start to cause them increasing difficulty. So that late childhood, teens, or even later, those traits can no longer be kind of managed, and a person then might develop coexisting mental health problems as well, and essentially get diagnosed that way. Interestingly, it says the genetic profile of people with late diagnosed autism actually looks more like depression, ADHD and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, than early childhood autism. So in other words, the genetic profile is very similar to that of depression, ADHD and PTSD. It's more similar to those conditions than the genes associated with with people who are diagnosed in toddlerhood or early childhood. So it's just a different way in which autism can manifest. It doesn't mention OCD or anxiety disorders anywhere in this research, so I'll be interested to know where they tie into this. I actually don't have depression. I seem to be quite a rarity in that respect among other autistic people that I've encountered. Like most autistic, not all of them, there are a few I've counted who don't have depression. Come to think of it, there are a few. But 9 times out of 10, autistic people seem to have depression or PTSD or something, and I've never had depression or PTSD. And people are often surprised when I tell them because, they just assume I would, considering I have such severe anxiety disorders and OCD, and my lifestyle is very limited and narrow. They think, well, that's a really depressing lifestyle. They think, aren't you depressed? And I said, no, I'm not depressed. I've never been depressed. I actually am quite sanguine in my mood. I'm quite an optimistic person, actually. Well, I don't know if I'm optimistic. I think I'm just a realist. But anyway, I just bumble along and just deal with it because it's all I've ever known. Doesn't mean my life is bloody difficult and I'm really disabled. But I'm not depressed and I've never been depressed. I don't know what it is to be depressed, quite frankly. My mood is never low. It's just never low. I'm always anxious. I'm always hypervigilant. But I'm never low, no. I'm never depressed. I guess maybe I'm just lucky. My grandmother had very severe depression, and we suspect she possibly was autistic, but she was a Holocaust survivor, and that probably played a part. She had PTSD, but again, that's kind of goes with the territory of being a Holocaust survivor. she was kind of manic. It's kind of like bipolar type depression. But yeah, if there are any genes on that line, I don't have them because I've never been depressed. So yeah, my parents, my dad, my mum, were never depressed either. So lucky, I suppose, in that respect. So I think I'm just like inherited genes that don't make you likely to get depressed. But I've not been lucky on the anxiety front because I'm the most anxious person there is. My neurotic levels are sky high. But yeah, it's interesting that they didn't really test. It didn't mention OCD or anxiety in this research. So I wonder if late diagnosed autistic genes are similar to both conditions, or whether this just applies to depression. Because if it just applies to depression, then it can't include me because I clearly don't have any depression genes because I'm not depressed at all. So I'll be interested to know about that. By the way, if any of you are watching this who are autistic and ever been depressed, let me know because I do feel quite a rare breed, particularly considering I have very severe anxiety disorders. I'll be interested to know. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the next video now to carry on talking about this because I just want to share some further thoughts on this study. So moving over to video number 2 now.